Welcome to episode 36 of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage your global websites. In the last episode, we took a close look at what goes into deciding whether your company's website should be multilingual or cater to multiple countries. We broke down the main factors to consider and the reasons those choices matter when reaching a global audience. Today, we're shifting our focus to something just as critical: how the era of AI is changing the way companies approach SEO. We're going to dive into what businesses need to rethink and how to keep their sites competitive as search engines get smarter. But before that, I want to jump in and talk about the recent article that Adam Gent wrote about in the Indexing Insight newsletter. I get his newsletter. I would recommend it to anybody. This was the Google Index Purge update, and there was a whole lot of great information in there. Like, according to his findings with his tool, he has a tool called Indexing Insight. It appears to reinforce the idea that Google's actively applying a multidimensional filter to content value, not just content presence. Meaning, Google's no longer treating indexing as a neutral act. It's behaving more like a curator, applying machine learning filters, and I always go back to this idea of, the fanning, how you put in a search and in AI, it's basically in the background running multiple searches, trying to come up with the intent and maybe even the next question, then the next question. Bill, did you get a chance to read this?
I did. I thought it was great. It actually was triggering for me and forced me to finish an article that I've been trying to write forever. I think it's a couple thousand words on more of a rant on this and how, what Adam showed. I think a couple key things in his data, because he's, using the Search Console API to pull in this data for his clients and watching those, changes. And I think, 25% of the monitored pages that were in his solution were removed. And it was interesting of how many pages that were previously indexed had been removed. And he goes into trying to understand why Google may be removing them. And this is sort of, as you were saying, I think Google is really applying a lot of factors to, whether they need this or not. And, I've been ranting about this forever. Is at some point, Google has to say, I don't need all this. I don't need 500 of these. And I think this is really what's happening, is Google's now being a lot more selective of what they do.
Yeah, I think this all goes back to the cost of indexation, right? They need to run a business, and especially with all this new AI content, everything's a copy. So they're trying to figure out what's important and forget about the rest. It's, I can imagine it's a 2%, 98% rule that they're using.
Sure. And if you put it at their scale, I mean, this is the thing I think most people, we, narrowly think of our own little world, right? But if you're a site that has, let's say, even 1 million pages or 10,000 pages, how many other pages does Google have to ingest? And this is what Fabrice always talks about, that there's this big sort of frontier set of content that's out there in the wild that they may never get to because they're sort of bogged down in, in the stuff that they're doing now. And I think that's, what's really changing is, like you said, this calculation, this value premise on, do we need it? Do we have it equally good from elsewhere? Does this content generate revenue opportunities for us? Does this content, does it get used? There's old stuff that maybe they don't need anymore. There's all these rules, and this was what I tried to put in the article today was, we've been working this training module for developers to get them to think about crawling. And the best way to get them to think about it is say, build a search engine. Think about building a search engine and how would you weight whether or not to crawl or index things. And I think that's what Adam is sort of proving was when he looks at the content that was removed, it seems to correlate very well to content that wasn't getting engaged or, didn't have value or any number of things. Go read his piece, and his indexing insight tool is actually really cool way for you to monitor something that we all should be looking at is what is the frequency of indexing, and is it indexed or not, and he's got a lot of great information about what each of the terms mean in Search Console about, Google has seen it but didn't index it, or, it's crawled but not indexed, and where he tries to break down those nuances. So definitely check it out. And I think it's a key piece in what we're going to talk about today, which is why, Bill, you thought it was good, because the whole idea of where AI is going, it all starts either with Google from an indexing or an ingestion into an LLM. And sort of what, we're dealing with, the segue slightly a little bit off topic is, Cloudflare came out recently and said, hey, we got this great tool where we can tell you if it's a bot and we can stop them cold. And if you want this content, if you're willing to pay for it, we'll let you in. And, that sort of sent a variety of reactions across the interwebs of, yay, we, take that, bastards, you're not going to get my content, to, whoa, wait a minute, we want them to come in.
Yeah.
And now you've got an intermediary who basically is the gatekeeper now for about 20% of the traffic on the internet, saying we can put up gates, we can put up a toll booth, if you will. And it was just interesting the way that was. And so it's very similar to my rant about crawling and indexing. I created a model that we're using in this training to say, well, what if, OpenAI creates their own rubric to say, well, do we need this or not? Is there somebody that's ungated that has it? Is there somebody that's not suing us that has it?
Right.
Do people even want it? So I think it was like a 17 factor rubric of, is it even worth our time paying the toll? And what's the toll worth? And this is, I made the analogy to it being surge pricing like they have in New York. If you come in during peak times, you pay more than if you come in after, similar to what we're experiencing here in Connecticut with our electricity. God forbid you use your AC on a 100+ day. You have to pay more for the electricity to power it. But anyways, it tees this up perfectly. Is that whole piece.
A really interesting article. We'll have a link to it in the notes. Check that out. Also, there was a note that I saw. Instagram is actually not blocking Google anymore, even though Google was crawling their stuff to begin with. But yeah, I think from a gated standpoint, the idea might be good for publishers, but like, how do people pay? What's the process? If I were running a crawler and needed to get in, how would I be able to pay for that? I think there's so much complexity, and not everybody is using Cloudflare.
Exactly. I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Can you bypass them, right? If they've only got 20%, that's a lot. And they named a bunch of people that use it, but then you've got Akamai on the other side. You've got people that don't use a CDN.
And there's people with the same information that's not on Cloudflare.
Exactly.
Right? So the answer is
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not that was sort of my take. It's not the panacea that a lot of people were making it out to be. And, I got a couple of negative comments that, I got to poo-poo everything apparently, that we can't have nice things without me sort of bringing people back to reality. But it was good. It was similar to my rant I wrote about, sort of the whole fair use side of this from a legal perspective, that, Meta actually won a case because the people actually, the interesting thing, I don't know if you read that piece, but where Meta won primarily on the basis that there was no mechanism for publishers to, there was no way for them to sell that access to the AI agents. And maybe that triggered Cloudflare to do this. And so one of my arguments was, by the virtue of having this now, can this potentially be, one of these things that may overturn
what
the judge said is fair use? There is or was no mechanism for them to pay a toll, if you will. But It's early days. I mean, this is the whole craziness, and that's the gist of, this topic is, how are things changing in this new age? And so many things, it's like the Wild West all over again. And, so I think we have 6 or 8 things we want to sort of showcase for folks today, around this that I think people should be looking at.
Yeah, so let's get into it then. So the main topic, you've just started a series of executive thought leadership articles for a search engine journal. The first one being Stop Retrofitting, Start Commissioning, the new role of SEO in the age of AI. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. But I really like the approach that you took to this with the shift from being reactive to proactive. So what was, you are a writing machine. I don't know anybody who can have an idea and have an article out in a day. What was the thing that triggered you to write this? I don't know how long it took you, but I'm just saying, if we talk about something, you have an article done by the next day. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I just sort of stopped caring about what people thought about it. That was always my issue. I have hundreds of articles that, like the one I mentioned earlier, I've been sitting on it for probably 2 years. And the trigger for this it was really 2 or 3 things. One, I was on a call with someone I was trying to tell them how their content needed to change. And they're like, well, we're tech B2B. We don't need to change. This is the way we write, and we're not going to change. And it's like, but the world is changing around you. Even trying to explain things like, especially in B2B, we gate a lot of things, right? It's bait. It's the lead gen side of it, right? We've got this amazing white paper that's like just pure gold. And, we give away 2 paragraphs. We put up a lead gen gate, and all the goodness is hidden. And it's sort of like, newspapers have done is they, throw up a paywall. And what I was arguing is that you need to think about this balance. I'm just saying for the future, think about this. So that was one catalyst. And the second was a guy I know is an HVAC engineer, and they were putting in a new system in a high rise locally. And he was telling me about this job of this guy who was not quite a foreman, but his official title on his business card was a commissioning agent. And I'm like, well, does he get a commission for doing stuff? What is this? And he goes, no, his job is to make sure that, he's like, it's a modern building inspector, but he's paid for by the client. And it was to make sure that the HVAC system they were putting in matched the architectural diagrams and the spec, that all the venting was where it was supposed to be. The machines that were bought like 5 years ago were still compatible with the current regs, but he was also tying it into the alarm system, the monitoring systems, the elevator systems. It was like systems and systems and systems. And this guy's sole job was to make sure it all works together. And I was like, oh my God, that's what, SEOs have to do. We have to play with.
If we do it right.
If we do it right, and if we're allowed to do it right, we're there at the beginning of a site rebuild or a site migration or in anything where, and we're the poor soul that is doing it. So those were the 2 catalysts. And that's how I started out, is saying that the old way, as you mentioned, was we would react to it. We would get the note that, hey, we went live on Friday, or we went live 2 weeks ago, and we noticed a significant decline in Google traffic. Can you help us? And it's like, what? You launched a site without any kind of SEO prep? And now we need to be in there way in advance, because now, again, all this AI stuff is changing things. So, I guess the third catalyst was explaining to somebody that the website that they consolidated from 40 pages, 1 page on each feature, down to 2 pages, where every feature might have been referenced in a bullet point because of content grazing, they were going to fail miserably, not only on SEO as it was last year, but this whole idea, like you were talking about, query fan outs and what is the next question, and what is the next question, and what is the next question. The fact that they took all this rich content and condensed it, and I said, just wait a couple weeks and then go into AI and do a search on something related to your software and a feature and see what gets returned.
Yeah.
and then ask it that magical question. Well, why aren't we in the consideration set? And it's going to tell you that, well, we couldn't find any reference to any of these points. So, the rules of building have changed. If we want to come back to that metaphor, again, we bought equipment 5 years ago because that's when we were getting funding to build the building. What's the delta between the standards today, the needs today, and the equipment we bought, or the wireframes we spec'd out previously? And so I think businesses need to rethink this. And I think mere mortal SEOs need to somehow, and we've been talking about this through our web effectiveness, mandates for, a year, on how companies need to rethink this. So that was the real core of it. And then I walked through some of the things that need to be rethink. Like, again, going back to your query fan out, back in the old days, we would look to go into a tool, find popular keywords, and then write content if it was related to us. Many people, if it wasn't related to us, and we'd sort of chuck it up on a web page and hope that we would get one of the 10 blue links for it. And now, that whole dynamic has changed. And this is where I think, Mike King has been making a lot of headway, making people angry, advocating for radical change, and where SEO is in the food chain with his whole relevance engineering approach, that we need to rethink this content. Again, going back to your point about query fanouts, I love Deep Sync because you can set the thinking part of Deep Sync, and it will tell you those queries.
Yeah. You can watch it run. Yeah.
You can watch it run. It says, hey, this guy looks like he wants to know about this. And so, okay, it's pretty funny. I said on a post recently, I think I found my new job where I can write snarky responses for people that actually read those chains as they go through, because it is like one that I ask, it's like, hey, no, I asked you this, but you gave me that. Why did you give me this result? And it's like, oh, this guy wants to reverse engineer my algorithm. And but it's literally that. When I ask, why did you include these results and not these? And that's really what's happening. And, we should do one where it'd be awesome if we actually did one live where we're looking at this. But this putting in the best in front of something, or putting in small business, or any criteria, it has to go and create a definition. What does best mean? What does small business mean? What does any of this mean? And so it's looking at this holistically. And I think a lot of us aren't really preparing content for that, and the clarity and the way that AI systems are parsing, and everybody's using the verbiage of chunking. They look for chunks of content around. If I had to define it, the way I was describing it to somebody, it's the way you've been creating content to get featured snippets, right? Here is a definition and here's the answer, like an FAQ.
Yeah.
Here's a question and here's an answer. Imagine an entire FAQ page being sucked in one go to build out a result.
I mean, that's the high level idea of a topical map, the Corey framework. It was when I first, so I've taken it 3 times. I think each time was probably, probably 10 to 12 hours long. And it was still a little confusing, but it was starting to make sense. I actually joined a cohort. I've been in a cohort now for 3 months, meeting weekly, twice. And it's starting to become more and more, it's like the Matrix. Like now you're starting to see stuff.
Yeah.
Like and Bill, no exaggeration, all of this stuff that everybody's starting to say aha with is stuff that is like so obvious in the training. Like Corey's been talking about this for 3 years, but he, a lot of the stuff he's basically wrote on the back of others, like all of the other people who have Bill Slawski and whatnot, who have done the heavy work with all of the patents. But so, they're looking at the matching attributes, the entities. It's looking for like what next, like you said, what is the real intent? And then if that's the intent, what would be their next question? And does that page answer the next question? And it builds and builds and builds. And if you do this right, you're not looking at pages. You're looking at, a whole semantic network of a website, usually which is, not a product website
Right,
for a product
exactly.
manufacturer. You're providing all the things like with problems and solutions and, how does alternatives and how-tos and, done right. Going back, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I started going heavy into customer journey. That's how I started to build out ideas for content. And, this is at the micro scale of that. When somebody does a search, Google's going through the customer journey and pulling back the right answers.
And that's really the key, right? It's about the intent. And there's an article I wrote, I think it was yesterday, I wrote about, because I did a webinar last week, and it was about this big shift. And in my part of it, I didn't get across everything I wanted to get across, but I try to put it in here. I think there's 3 things that have changed. And I think this gets to the crux of everything. The first is this relentless focus on answering user intent. Why are they doing this query? Here's the thing. I've got a series that I haven't posted that originally was going to say stuff I said 20 years ago nobody cared about, but it's, I softened it and said, what's old is new. And where we talked about exactly that, the simple question, when somebody does a query, why did they ask that? What are they looking for? And like you talked about, this customer journey, these query chains.
Yeah, where
We
are they?
built these models at IBM, like in the before 2000, we were building these. And I think I mentioned before, I did a project for Sony. We couldn't find, this is probably in 2000, we couldn't find a single pathway where they were represented from TV to model and all the queries in between, right? Somebody literally putting in TV.
Navigation?
Anywhere on the website. There was nowhere if somebody did a query for TVs, they might have been there. And then a Sony model. I mean, nobody was, but I'm picking on Sony unfairly. But what about all the things in the middle? As people realize there's different types of TV. Okay, I want a plasma, or I want a flat screen, or a smart TV. Things we have today, the dynamics are different. And then wonder if I want this feature and this function. And, and we've always talked about there's those micro moments where this query leads to this query, to this query, to this query.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's really chained that. So Corey has done that, and we got to give him props for doing that. But I mean, these were things that Mike and I talked about. We had whole chapters on thinking across the buy cycle and searcher intent in a book that we published in 2005. And so that's the first one. Then the second one is this: what's happened is really the drive to eliminate friction and deliver information. Because think about all these things, in order to get mind share and market share and use share and whatever, they got to be functional. Why did Google displace everybody else? Because you could get what you wanted.
Yeah.
Right? But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, they've really protected the searcher. I mean, their whole business model is number of ads shown, right? So people, they don't ever want anybody going anywhere else but Google to do a search for information. And they
okay, that's my point number 3. So again, back in the day, they would show, if you wanted to know what time is it in Reykjavik, Iceland, right? They didn't give you the result, but they gave you people that had that result, and you had to click a stupid blue link to get an answer. And then someone said, that's calculatable.
Yeah.
We can show that. And then immediately, 10,000 websites that did nothing more than have a bunch of crap about Reykjavik, Iceland, that what time it is, based on the IP of your server, would tell you the time, right? Yeah. And so they started to say, look, what other friction can we remove? The third one is what you're getting to, is this monetization and data harvesting. The fact that they can gate people, keep them within the Google ecosystem, keep them within the, ChatGPT ecosystem, as costs mounted, then there's a whole set of things that happen. AI, speed, computing power, all of this made sort of the era of monetization more possible by calculating this stuff. Like I always go back to this query. One of the most powerful slides I ever shown to an audience that really literally got gaffes and people like, oh my God, this is like, mind crushing, was the query where I did Thai restaurants near me. And in the search suggest box was a Thai restaurant that was 78 miles away. And why was Google showing me that as an option? And why did they show up versus the one that was a mile away? Because they use schema with longitude and latitude, making it easy for Google to calculate where that was. The restaurant that I go to had their address in an image, meaning Google didn't have an easy way to know that. So they were promoting one that was way farther than I would drive for Thai food over the one that was nearby because lack of calculatable data points.
Yeah.
And so think about that. They need my IP, my longitude and latitude. They need the restaurant's longitude and latitude, and they need to calculate the delta between that, the distance. That's computing power. So now that we have cheaper computing power, we're able to do that. So that's really what's changed. And then now they're able to do all this other stuff. They can gamify better. They can, keep us in whatever way you want to look at that. But the point is a lot of stuff that's been, disintermediated. And the thing that I wonder is the sites that have lost 30 to 40% of their traffic because Google could show an answer, did they actually deserve that traffic to begin with?
Right.
I'm not going to argue that today. But what I'm getting at is these consumption patterns. Are we making sure that we're so your point that a product website is textbook perfect, where we probably have 4 or 5 bullets, maybe a paragraph of our claim to fame, and then that's all we have. This is why retailers and affiliates do well, because people actually want more than that. They want reviews. This is why Reddit does well, because they want real people's opinions. They could be gamified, but real people opinions. And that's why, I gave an example at PubCon that I was looking for a specific sort of functionality around a Lenovo laptop. And Lenovo wasn't in the top 10 results because they didn't answer the question. Everybody else did because they took the data points to the next level. They got out of their way of having bulletized. So that was the point there. Then the next one was really this idea is, how does all this happen? We need to have grown-up conversations, cross-functional integration. So now the product team, let's go back to your product example, right? The people creating the product information need to talk to the SEO team to understand how AI is treating this content. They need to talk to the tech team. Something as simple as, like I talked to a guy recently, he said, I had a bunch of my products drop out of Google results. And I said, give me one of the products. And I went to the page. He said, why didn't you go to Google? I said, I went to the page. And I looked at his schema. And he was using product schema, and it said out of stock. And I said, if you're telling Google that your product is out of stock, why would they show that to people looking for the product? Because if they show the schema saying it's out of stock, they're never going to click to begin with. He goes, but they might. And it's Bill, we've heard that, but they might is like the mantra of every store owner in the world.
People need to think about Google and cost of indexation and why would I?
And the people, Google may index it, but they know somebody that sees, and he says, well, can we take that schema off? So you still don't have the damn product. How can they buy a product you don't have? But the traffic, and they might buy something else. So again, that's our very selfish, myopic view of the world. Instead of saying, what if I do have a similar product? How do we make those connections between A and B?
Yeah.
Right. And that's why these teams need to talk. The merchandising team needs to talk to the product team, to the web team, to the team injecting, schema. And the idea, what we were talking about the webinar with Milestone the other day, is this idea of multimodal. And I know you deal with this with clients that want images of their products to show up, images of how their products are used to show up, or videos of how their products being used in videos. And if you just think about this, and I did a query, my son told me about a query for a project he's working on. Well, he can't use the word used. You have to use pre-owned. Pre-owned Rolex Submariner Boston. And we unpacked that query. So pre-owned means I don't want a new one.
Yeah.
I want a used one. Rolex is a specific brand. Submariner is a specific product name or, brand within a brand. And then Boston said, I want to know who has it in the Boston area.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody outside of Boston proper has now been excluded. Everybody that except in paid, because, the guy in California thinks somebody in Boston's going to buy an $80,000 watch online. But again, Google's now going to stack that deck. If you do that query, look at what comes up. A block of paid ads, a local pack, and then 4 rows of shopping carousel ads.
Yeah.
That's a shopping feed.
Yeah.
Right. So are you in the shopping feed? Are you in the local pack? Are you in paid? Or there was a paid ad block, with shopping ads. There was 2 organic sort of commingled after the 4 rows of the shopping feed, more similar products. And so if we step back and think, wow, how do I get in this whole mix?
Yeah.
I've got to have the image. I got to talk.
It probably had a left rail of all of the meta, right? Like maybe price range, colors, weight,
sizes,
material.
All of that.
Yeah.
Right. So all of this now, and the left rail is actually a great one that I was talking about in an article that's coming up, is the fact that Google, and I think I showed this when they had the pills at the top. When they first introduced that, I talked about it at a conference to say, the fact that Google can have these pills at the top tells me they know secondary and other third and fourth queries of how people are drilling. If not, they can look at query variations to know what people want. The fact that they have that left rail, those meta attributes, it's like, come on.
Yeah.
When you start to see that, we need to have a grown-up conversation with the people that produce the content, the people that create the pages, the people that write about it, all of this, because that game has now changed. Because we need to make sure we're tripping the switches to be in the left rail. We need to make sure that it's all synchronized, because when I looked at this result, there was only one person, one store that was 2. And yet there was all these different modes, if you will. So we got to think about this multimodal. We got to think about it, which means we got to think about it multidisciplinary. We need to think about it. And then coming back to multi-mode and multidiscipline, the other big thing that people have been talking about is all this, you got to be found. You got to be authoritative. You got to be the marketer on steroids. And what's interesting is if you actually do that query that says, give me the criteria, or validate this statement that I need to be more authoritative to be in AI search results. All the articles that Perplexity uses and references for those statements all came from PR firms on how you needed more PR, right? So again, it goes back to this consensus bias has been skewed by people that benefit from making you more findable and more marketable and more aware. I'm not poo-pooing that in any way. I'm just saying, and I totally agree with it, because we've got to be in, you mentioned Instagram. We've got to be doing the Instagram thing. We've got to be doing the other social things, so that if it's a context that warrants that, we would be there. Again, it's a team sport, which you and I have talked about forever.
I mean, and unfortunately, it's a lot of work, right? So if you're selling parts cleaner chemicals, you're going to need to cover, will this consistently work within my process? Is it safe for my team to handle? What's the total cost of ownership? Is it going to eliminate the source of our failure? Like, is it really a solution? Is it something that will replace the chemical I'm currently using? and you almost have to write for all of the different personas.
Right.
I want to remind people of our free Facebook group where we use that as an opportunity to discuss these things, and you can ask any questions you want. You can also suggest ideas for upcoming podcasts. You can find that by searching International Web Mastery Free Group.
So the analogies I would give it is somebody walks into your physical store and they talk to Bob or Sally at the counter. We need to somehow suck the knowledge out of Bob and Sally's brain and make it available for people connect to it. And like you said, in one regard, I think I've made this sound like a daunting task. We could just close up shop and be done with it. We can't do this. That's not what I'm saying. It's just we need to be smarter about it. And I think this may be where smaller businesses may be a slightly more agile than bigger businesses. Because exactly that, if people are looking for a solution and you've made solutions and you can offer solutions, basically what you would spend 10 minutes in the store explaining to someone, can you come in and can you get, I mean, I'm spitballing here, but what if you use something like Riverside or Camtasia or whatever, you come in and you ask people, I don't know, you have a list of problems you find from wherever. Hey, Bob, I've got this. I've got green algae. The motor on my pool pump sounds funky.
Yeah.
How is Bob going to answer the motor in my pool pump sounds funky? And then can you take that transcript and then, beat it into somewhat form of submission and chuck it up on the web? Mm-hmm. Those things like that is something that, again, it costs money in theory, but if you have somebody else do it, but why can't you set your people down in front of these tools and have them, do a brain dump and then jiggle it into some form. I'm not saying do it for every minutia, not 30 years of Bob or Sally's experience, but what are the top 10 things people ask you when they walk up to your counter? Or what's the top 10 emails you get from people?
And what's their follow-up question?
Exactly. And that's the chain of custody that you really were talking about earlier is if I ask this, does it trigger the next one? Does it trigger the next one? And how do we structure this where we navigate people through this? And don't even get me started about how poorly built chatbots are, on websites. Like I just went to one and the very terminology they were using about canceling my Norton antivirus subscription, they didn't even have their own language in the chatbot. I had to go to Google and say, where's the article on how to cancel or downgrade or, modify? And I put all these descriptors in there because their fancy, probably cost $1 million chatbot system didn't have any of that. Now, is that on purpose that they didn't want me to unsubscribe or downgrade? Foolish on their part because I had a pretty nasty rant about how pissed I was about that. But again, this is where we're going. And I think the last point I want to make is evolving skills and mindset. Exactly to your point. We need to think about this content deeper. We need to think about these processes, how they're working. We don't know all of them yet. Nobody knows how it all works, but we've got enough information, especially stuff Corey's putting out and others, to tell us that we do need to start thinking differently. And then just the last of the last is, we need to think about measurement. How do we measure this? So traffic is not going to be a good one. Are we being mentioned? I sort of poo-pooed the tools a little hard recently about personalization and all this that, my query and your query for the same topic is going to be different. So maybe they're not good, but there's, some directional signals. Are we getting traffic from the AI engines? I saw Melissa Jensen from Cisco just posted, she's been extracting the # text URLs of what Google is showing. And when I ask something and they go down into the page and, they find that snippet, that segment, that becomes part of the URL or, anything to show you that stuff is being, even that AI bots have been there to visit. And because you may not know, if you just sign up with Cloudflare today and you're by default blocked, you're never going to see that traffic. So something like that we need to look at. And we need to fully expect that we're going to lose traffic, but can we tweak our answers, if you will, in the AI answers or in whatever chat tool you use to somehow make them engagement? And I know, you've done things in the past where, you've had lists of stuff and you would have, maybe number 5 or number 6 is, click to see the bigger list or some messaging like that, where there's a call to action buried in the answer. So getting creative about that engagement. But that's the genesis of the article. That's what it's saying is, hey, we got to play like a team player. We've got to evolve our mindset. We've got to understand why this is happening. And then where it makes sense for your business, you're going to have to start moving in that direction. And the last thing I want to say is Google still brings a crazy amount of traffic through the old way. So don't just say, hey, Google's done and let me move on and just put all my money in paid media or, this be a TikTok's, influencer, because there's still a lot of traffic to be earned from it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all of these things go back to, I don't know what podcast episode it was, but we had talked about a VP of answers. I really like that idea. If you could have someone whose job it is to ferret out all this stuff and at least have a list that you can work through when you have the time to work through.
Totally makes sense.
All right. So shift from reactive to proactive. Emphasize semantic structure over keywords. Build for AI first consumption patterns. Crafting clear self-containing sections. What do they call them? Passages.
Yep.
Right. So you want to basically answer questions succinctly, short areas, and then follow up with the follow-up questions. You want to integrate across disciplines and teams. Measure what matters. I think a lot of people are going to have to think differently as far as KPIs until everybody can get their AI KPIs into the search tools. Some are doing it now. Some are doing it and charging a crap load of money. And then there's other stuff out there, but it's not unreasonable to look at impressions. I think that's a good thing. The more impressions means Google likes you more, and that's stuff you should be focusing on. So how would you tell people to evolve skills and mindsets?
Just really, take in the things we were talking about and think of those, what's changed, and, thinking about how do we adapt to this? So, things like really looking at structured data, not just structured data from schema, but structuring exactly like you said, here's the top level and you move down into the issues. Think about, do we need to write differently? Share data with people about, how this stuff is being scored and viewed. I don't think people should jump on necessarily the cosine and all those, doing all the math behind a lot of it. I think that's overkill for a lot of people. But just think about, is this saying what needs to be said? Really, the biggest change is looking at this holistically. Do we have synergies between this? The number one thing I think people should go and do today is go into some of these tools and look for what you do in context of you and without context of you and see what shows up. Right? How are you being presented? And then ask that question, why wasn't I there? Why wasn't I in the results set? And this is the key thing. It's going to tell you, well, we couldn't find any of these features. We couldn't find any of these functions. We couldn't find anybody that had given a positive review about you. Just read that answer. And that probably tells you what you need to change in terms of the way you structure the data, the way you prepare data, and then the way to think about this going forward. Because, if you don't comply, if you will, you're not going to be seen. Somebody else will be. And I think, however we need to get that point across to management who can free up resources and people and change the hearts and minds that this is truly a team sport. I think that's where we got to go next.
Great. Thanks, Bill. All right. If you've made it this far, we'd really, really appreciate it if you'd give us some ratings. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. What we haven't said before, but you might want to know is we also have these filmed and posted on YouTube. We hope you're finding the value in our conversations. Please rate and review wherever you can. We also want to hear from you. Your feedback helps motivate us and keeps us making these. And Bill and I are here to respond. We want to know who's listening. Just ping us. That would be great. Thanks, Bill. Until next time.
We'll see you.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying Hreflang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.